It came in the mailbox like any other envelope. No handwriting, no return address, just a printed label with my name placed neatly in the center, as though someone pressed print without a second thought. I opened it slowly. Inside was a birthday invitation for my granddaughter, Amelia, but something about it made my chest tighten. No love, Gregory and Elise. No hope you can make it, Mom. Not even a tiny note scribbled in the corner. Just the cold formality of a time, a date, and a place. It was the kind of card you'd send to a distant neighbor, not to your own mother. Not to a grandmother. It felt like the start of something I couldn't quite name yet. But deep down, I already knew I wasn't supposed to go. I sat at the kitchen table, the invitation still in my hand, as the late afternoon sunlight spilled across the wood. The corners of the card were stiff, sharp, like it had just come off the press. It carried the faint scent of toner and cardboard. I flipped it over once, then again. Nothing. No handwritten note. No warmth. Not even a signature. It wasn't the kind of invitation you'd save in a keepsake box for years. It was the kind you'd toss into a drawer and forget. But I couldn't forget. This would be Amelia's 9th birthday. I remembered the very first one I attended. She had icing smeared on her chin, struggling to blow out candles bunched too closely together. Back then, Gregory used to beam with pride whenever I walked into the room. Even Elise smiled at me that first year. She even asked for my ginger cookies, said they tasted like Christmas. Now, all I had was this glossy card, blank and polished. I placed it next to my coffee cup and watched the steam curl upward, as if trying to carry my thoughts somewhere else. Part of me wanted to take the hint and stay away. But another part, an older, quieter part, refused to be dismissed like a piece of junk mail. Maybe some of you have felt it, too, that subtle shift in a family's tone. It never happens all at once. It creeps in slowly, so quietly you barely notice, until one day you wake up and realize the warmth has drained away. And suddenly, you're standing alone on the porch of something you used to call home. Still, I told myself maybe I was overthinking. Maybe they were busy. Maybe they just forgot to sign it. Maybe. But even then, deep down, I knew better. This wasn't an oversight. It was a message, and I wasn't sure I was ready to face what it meant. I placed the invitation on the small table near the hallway mirror and left it there for a few days. Every time I walked past, I would glance at it, hoping anything might change. Of course, it never did. But on the 4th morning, I found myself reaching for it again, not to question its meaning this time, but to accept it. I had decided I would go. It wasn't pride that pushed me, and it wasn't hope either. It was something quieter. Maybe it was the memory of Amelia's tiny hand wrapped around mine at the park. Or maybe it was the way she used to trace the cover of that old fairy tale book I kept on my shelf. I remembered promising her I'd read every story until she could read them on her own. That book, bound in fading green cloth, became the very first thing I set aside for her gift. I pulled out a small wooden box from the linen closet. Inside were photos, postcards, letters, and at the very bottom the book. I opened it gently. Some pages were loose, a few corners torn, but the illustrations still carried their color. I placed it carefully into a simple gift bag lined with tissue paper. Then I walked into the kitchen. I hadn't baked in a while, but my hands remembered the rhythm. Butter, sugar, cinnamon, the same cookies Amelia used to ask for every Christmas. The smell drifted through the house like an old lullaby. I packed them neatly into a tin, layering parchment between each row. When both gifts were ready, I sat there for a long moment, my hands resting in my lap. There were no butterflies, no expectations, just a quiet readiness, like my body had already accepted whatever was coming. Before leaving, I wrote a small card for Amelia, just a few lines in my own handwriting, nothing heavy. I told her I loved her and wished her the happiest birthday. I slipped the note between the pages of the fairy tale book, right where the story of the brave little girl crossing the dark forest began. I wrapped everything carefully, checked the address twice, and stepped outside. The sky was overcast, the kind of muted gray that made the whole world feel hushed. I took a slow breath, locked the door behind me, and walked toward the car. I didn't call ahead. I didn't text. I didn't ask permission. I simply followed the quiet thread of something unfinished, something still alive beneath all the silence. The drive was long but familiar. Every turn carried a memory: the tree Gregory climbed when he was 10, the gas station where he bought his first soda, and finally, their house. Still white with blue shutters, still a neatly trimmed lawn and flower pots lined along the porch. I parked across the street and sat there for a moment, watching families arrive with wrapped gifts and bright helium balloons. Laughter spilled out each time the door opened. It was the sound of celebration. I looked down at the gift bag and cookie tin resting on the passenger seat. Then I gathered them gently into my arms. One last deep breath, one steady step forward. I crossed the street and walked toward the front door. Whatever waited behind it, I had shown up. That mattered more than they would ever admit. The walkway was lined with balloons tied to little white stakes swaying gently in the wind. I stepped over a stray ribbon and adjusted the bag in my hand. Through the front windows, I saw shapes moving, children darting past, a few adults gathered near the kitchen, streamers hanging across the ceiling. The house looked just as I remembered it, but somehow it felt foreign now, like a story that had kept going long after I'd stopped being written into it. I climbed the porch steps carefully, making sure not to jostle the cookie tin. My hand hovered near the doorbell, but before I could press it, the door opened. Gregory stood there. His face was unreadable. Not angry, not welcoming, just still. He didn't look surprised, almost as if he had been waiting by the door, listening for my steps. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. I stood there holding the gifts, and he stood in the doorway, silent. Then he stepped outside and gently pulled the door closed behind him. I heard the latch click. The sound was quiet but final. He didn't speak right away. His eyes dropped to the gift bag, then to the tin, and finally lifted to meet mine. I opened my mouth, but he raised one hand just slightly. Not to stop me. It was more like a quiet signal, a gesture rehearsed. He said softly that it would be better if I didn't come in. His voice didn't shake. There was no anger in it, no warmth either. It was the kind of tone someone uses when they're reciting policy, like a manager in a store saying, "This isn't personal, just procedure." He told me it wasn't a good idea. He said it might make things uncomfortable. That the kids didn't need the stress. That Elise had worked hard on everything and didn't want any distractions. Then he paused, as if he didn't want to say the next part, but had decided it was necessary. And then he said it, that I wasn't really a part of things anymore. Not cruelly, not loudly, just plain, simple words, spoken like a fact. He didn't even look at me when he said it. He stared at the doormat beneath our feet, like the words were written there, and he was just reading them aloud. I couldn't move my arms. I kept holding the gifts like they still belonged somewhere, like someone inside might open the door any second, laugh, and tell him he was being ridiculous. But no one did. I asked him quietly if Amelia knew I had come. He didn't answer. His gaze drifted past me, out toward the road, like he was waiting for someone else to arrive. I stood there for another long breath. Then I handed him the bag and the tin. I said nothing. There was nothing left to say that would land where it needed to. He took them with the same practiced stillness, then turned the knob behind him. The door opened, swallowed the light, and then closed again. I walked back to the car, not in anger, not even in sadness, just in that kind of silence where something inside you shifts slowly, but permanently. I didn't start the engine right away. I just sat there, watching the house, wondering how something so familiar could feel so unreachable. That was the moment the door truly closed. Not just on the house, but on the version of me that still waited to be invited in. When I got home, I didn't take my coat off. I stood in the hallway for a long time, staring at the space above the entry table where I used to hang pictures. There had been one of Gregory there for years holding Amelia as a baby, but I had taken it down last spring. I remember telling myself it was just to dust the frame, but I never put it back up. I walked into the kitchen and set the empty cookie tin on the counter. I didn't bother unpacking the small gift bag I had brought back with me. The silence in the house pressed in close, heavy and unyielding. The only sounds were the low hum of the fridge and the faint crackle of the baseboard heater warming the tile beneath my feet. Later that evening, as the sky dimmed into a heavy orange dusk, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Elise. She didn't start with a greeting, just the words, "Don't make this into a scene." Gregory already explained everything. There was no warmth in it. No curiosity about whether I was all right. Just a warning, as if I had done something wrong simply by showing up. I didn't respond. I set the phone face down on the table and stared at the wall. I don't know how long I sat like that, the silence stretching endlessly around me. Eventually, I stood and walked to the hallway closet. I reached past the coats and pulled out an old cedar filing box. It smelled faintly of dust and memory. Inside were documents I hadn't touched in years, deeds, old tax papers, letters from my husband when he was overseas with the VA. Buried near the bottom was the thing I was looking for, the deed to the cabin in Walnut Creek. The cabin Gregory thought was already his. I ran my fingers slowly over the name at the top. Mine, still mine, no transfer, no cosign. He had always assumed that once he turned 35, the cabin would just pass to him naturally. He spoke of it like it was already his. The summer he said he'd install solar panels. The deck extension he never built. It was part of his plans, part of his story. But he never asked, and I never said yes. Back then, I told myself I was just giving him room to feel responsible, but the truth was simpler. I was tired of explaining myself, tired of being reminded that my opinion no longer mattered unless it matched what Gregory wanted. I folded the document gently and placed it on the table beside me. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like a shadow in my own home. Elise's message was meant to shut me down. Instead, it opened a door I had quietly closed years ago, because what they didn't know was this. I had never signed anything over, and if they were comfortable pushing me out of their lives, they might want to think twice about building their future on land that didn't belong to them. Not yet. Not ever, if I chose so. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. The light was soft, not quite daylight yet, that faint blue-gray shade the world wears when it's still holding its breath. I sat by the kitchen window, a mug of coffee warming my hands, and stared out at the empty street. The deed to the cabin lay beside me, still unfolded from the night before. My mind wandered back not just to Gregory as a boy, but further, to the days when that cabin wasn't just a piece of property. It was where my husband taught Gregory how to split wood. It was where I learned to patch a leaky roof and scrub soot out of the old stone fireplace using vinegar and salt. The floors creaked. The insulation was awful, but it was ours. The first time we stayed there after Ron's funeral, it was early November. The cold had already settled deep into the valley. Gregory was 16, quiet, angry, lost. I was still numb. I brought the urn, wrapped in a wool blanket, and placed it on the mantel. Gregory didn't say much during that trip. But one night, after I had gone to bed, I heard him downstairs. The next morning, there was a small pile of kindling stacked perfectly beside the fireplace. That was his way of grieving. Years later, when Gregory asked if he could take over the cabin, I didn't say no. But I didn't say yes either. He never asked again. I suppose he took my silence as permission. Now, looking back, I could see how easily assumptions grow into entitlement. And I had let it happen. I had allowed the story to be rewritten without me. But the cabin wasn't a gift to be claimed. It wasn't a prize waiting for someone to deserve it. It was the one piece of my life untouched by negotiation, pride, or performance. It was memory and loss and love, layered into wood and stone. I finished my coffee and set the mug in the sink. Then I walked down the hallway to the closet and pulled out an old photo box. Inside were prints from disposable cameras, faded at the edges. One of Gregory on Ron's shoulders, fishing pole in hand. Another of me standing on the cabin porch, apron dusted with flour, holding out a plate of cinnamon rolls to two laughing boys. At the very bottom was a Polaroid I didn't know I had kept. Ron and I during the cabin's very first winter. Snow behind us, his arm around my shoulders, on the back, in his handwriting. Home is wherever we're stubborn enough to keep it. I held that photo for a long time. Then I placed it next to the deed. I wasn't just holding on to a building. I was holding on to the last place where I had felt like myself completely and without condition. And maybe, just maybe, it was time I stopped waiting for someone else to see that. Maybe it was time I started seeing it again for myself. It had been nearly 7 years since I last saw Carol in person. We used to work together at the VA Medical Center in Oakland. She was the kind of woman who carried herself like she'd seen the worst of life and learned how to laugh anyway. After we both retired, we spoke on the phone now and then, holiday calls, birthdays, the occasional update when someone from the old unit passed. But that Sunday morning, she showed up at my front door, without warning. I opened it to find her standing there with a small bag of groceries and a look that told me she already knew more than she should. She stepped inside, gave me a quick hug, and walked straight into my kitchen like she had done it 1,000 times before. "You didn't even tell me it was Amelia's birthday," she said, unpacking the bag, eggs, bread, a pint of blueberries. I had to hear it from Sandra's daughter. Said Elise rented a bounce house and posted half the party online. I didn't answer. I just sat at the table and watched her make herself at home. She poured coffee for both of us, then finally sat down across from me. "They didn't let you in, did they?" I shook my head once. Carol's expression didn't change much. She had work trauma wards. She knew silence sometimes spoke louder than a breakdown. You ever update the title on that cabin? She asked. I hesitated, then reached for the deed still resting on the buffet behind me and slid it across the table. She scanned it, nodded slowly. So, it's still under your name, she said. That's something. Then she leaned forward slightly. Listen, Doris, this isn't just a family rift. I've seen this pattern before. When people want to erase someone, they start with the story, but eventually they go after the paper trail, your name, your place, your rights. Her words landed heavier than I expected. I stared at the edge of the table. They think you're quiet, she continued, and maybe you have been, but they don't get to write you out of the life you built. If they're using that cabin as leverage, you have every right to stop them. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a small white card, sliding it toward me. Linda Alvarez. Elder estate and property law. She's sharp, Carol said. Younger than we were when we started, but she knows how to move through this kind of mess. Talk to her, Doris. Even if you don't act now, you need to know exactly where you stand. We spent the rest of the morning talking around old memories and half-burnt muffins. But Carol's visit wasn't just about comfort. It was a quiet nudge, a reminder that I still had choices, that I wasn't a ghost wandering through someone else's story. After she left, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at Linda's card. It had been years since I stood up for myself in a way that made others uncomfortable, but maybe that was the problem. Maybe it was time they felt a little uncomfortable too. I met Linda Alvarez 2 days later, in a small office downtown, tucked between a bakery and an old bookstore. Her office was modest but neat, every file stacked with purpose. There was no unnecessary charm, no small talk meant to fill silence. Everything about her carried quiet confidence. Carol had already briefed her. Linda had a scanned copy of the deed, the property records, and surprisingly a copy of Gregory's startup financing pitch deck. She turned her laptop toward me, highlighting one particular section. My heart stopped when I read it. Gregory had listed the cabin as a collateral asset. Her voice was calm, measured. Your son is using the cabin to secure a second-stage funding round, she explained. Which becomes a problem, given that the title is still entirely under your name. I kept my face steady, but inside my stomach tightened. Linda scrolled further, tapping her pen against the screen. He claimed it was inherited, she said softly, passed down to him with no disputes. He even states that no other party has ever contested ownership. I shook my head slowly. I never signed anything, I said. I never agreed to joint ownership. That place was mine before his first tooth even came in. Linda nodded firmly and leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. You still hold the title. That gives you complete legal control, she said. But if you don't act now, his lenders may assume his claim is valid. And once money changes hands, things get complicated. I stared at the papers, silent for a moment. She waited. Finally, I asked, "What do we do?" Linda slid a set of documents across the desk. "We file a notice of claim," she said, "that formally alerts the banks, investors, and public record that this property is not his to leverage, not aggressive, just firm. Once we file, Gregory can't legally use the cabin as collateral. And you won't need to confront him directly. I'll handle all communications." I looked down at the papers, tracing the edges with my fingertips. For so long, I had let things slide, thinking silence kept the peace. But silence was exactly what had erased me. I picked up the pen. My hand didn't shake ... as I signed my name. I felt something shift deep in my chest. Not fear, not regret. Something closer to relief, like a weight lifting from my shoulders. Linda gathered the documents neatly, sliding them into a folder. "You should know," she said quietly. "This might rattle some people. Truth has a way of shaking the tree." I nodded, steady in a way I hadn't been in years. "Then let it shake," I said. The notice of claim went out on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday evening, I had 8 missed calls from Gregory ... 3 voicemails I didn't listen to, and a long email from Elise filled with words like concern and misunderstanding. But I wasn't confused. For the first time in years, I was clear. I didn't respond. Instead, I packed a small weekend bag and drove up to Walnut Creek with Carol. The cabin had always been my retreat, but that weekend it felt like something more: reclamation. When we arrived, the front steps were still sturdy, though the paint on the railing had begun to peel. The air smelled faintly of pine and damp earth, the way it always had. Carol unlocked the door and pushed it open. Dust motes floated through a beam of sunlight like a quiet welcome. The first thing I did was head straight to the kitchen. I opened the drawers, straightened the silverware, and tossed out expired spices. Carol swept the floors and pulled back the curtains, letting the light spill across the worn wooden counters. We worked in silence, the kind only old friends can share, the kind where you don't need to fill the air with words. In the back hallway, I found a box of photographs Gregory had packed up years ago. I sat on the floor and opened it slowly, lifting each frame as though it might break in my hands. There we were, the 3 of us, in wool sweaters, red noses from sledding, cheeks flushed from cold, and laughter. Another photo showed Gregory perched on his father's shoulders, a tiny fishing pole in his hand. And then one of just me and Ron, standing by the stone fire pit, holding mugs of cider. I wiped the dust from the glass and placed that one back on the mantel. That one would stay. We didn't speak of the legal mess, not out loud. It lingered in the air like the mountain fog, heavy but unspoken. Carol, ever practical, started a fire in the hearth. I brewed tea and carried 2 steaming mugs to the porch. We sat there, wrapped in blankets, listening to the quiet crackle of burning wood. The silence was comforting, but it didn't last. That evening, my phone buzzed again. I glanced at the screen. Gregory. I hesitated, then set it back down. It buzzed again. This time, I read the text. I saw the legal claim. "You've made your point. But this is going to ruin things for me." I stared at the words for a long time. Then I turned off my phone and slipped it into the drawer beside the old rotary dial. The next morning, Carol and I hiked the short trail behind the cabin. The path was overgrown, but familiar beneath my feet. I hadn't walked it in years, yet somehow my body remembered the way. At the ridge, where the creek curved through the trees, the old wooden bench still stood, a little crooked, but steady. We sat there for a while, letting the breeze carry through the tall grass. Carol handed me a thermos of coffee. "You did the right thing," she said softly. "Not just legally, emotionally. You drew a line." I nodded ... For the first time in years. I didn't feel guilty. I felt whole. Later that afternoon, I opened the small desk drawer and pulled out a notebook. I sat by the window, pen in hand, and began to write, not about Gregory, not about Elise, but about myself. I wrote the words slowly, as though carving them into stone. I am not invisible. I am still here. And this place, this patch of trees, this cabin, this creek was not theirs to erase me from. By Saturday morning, the fog had lifted from the valley below. I stood at the kitchen window, watching the sunlight stretch softly over the tree line. The silence felt different now. Not empty, not aching. This silence was mine. At 10 o'clock that morning, a silver SUV pulled up the gravel driveway. A man stepped out, early 40s, trimmed suit, polished shoes not meant for uneven ground. He didn't pause to take in the mountains or the scent of pine. He walked straight to the porch like he had somewhere better to be. I opened the door before he could knock. Mrs. Dorsey, he said, adjusting the strap on his briefcase. My name is Matthew Clean. I represent your son. I stepped aside without a word and let him in. Carol was sitting in the living room, a book open in her lap. She glanced up but didn't speak. Matthew declined her offer of coffee and opened his briefcase at the dining table. He pulled out a thin folder and set it down between us. The air in the room shifted. He spoke calmly, deliberately. Gregory and Elise would like to resolve this without further escalation, he began. They're prepared to make a financial offer in exchange for your cooperation in transferring the property title. We believe it's in everyone's best interest to avoid unnecessary exposure. He slid the folder across the table. I didn't touch it. He continued, his tone smooth, practiced. We would, of course, handle all paperwork discreetly. You would retain certain visitation rights if you wish, but full ownership would transfer to Gregory. I stood, walked to the mantel, and lifted the framed deed my husband had built into its wooden case. I returned to the table and opened the document. My finger traced the line near the bottom where my name was written, still sharp and permanent. This isn't just property, I said quietly. This is memory. This is promise. This is the last thing my husband touched before he died, and my name is still on it. Matthew didn't flinch, but he didn't press either. He closed the folder slowly and slid it back into his briefcase. If you change your mind, he said evenly, we're open to further conversation. I walked him to the door. Before stepping down, he paused and turned back. You should know, he said. This is already affecting Gregory's investors. I let the words hang in the air. Then I met his gaze. Everyone has to live with the consequences of what they erase, I said. I closed the door gently behind him. Carol exhaled softly from the couch. We didn't speak for a long moment. The folder he left behind sat untouched on the table. That night, I burned it page by page. The flames curled around each carefully worded offer, each veiled threat wrapped in courtesy. I didn't need their offer. I already had what they would never have, a place that remembered me. The following afternoon, the wind picked up through the pines. I was stacking kindling near the back porch when I heard the gate creak. I thought it might be Carol returning from her walk. But the footsteps were lighter, quicker. I turned and there she was. Amelia. Her hair was tied back in a crook ponytail, shoes a little muddy, cheeks pink from the cold. She clutched a small worn tote bag, the kind I used to carry when I picked her up from school. She didn't say a word at first. She just stood there, looking at me. I froze, not out of fear, not out of anger, but from something deeper. Something that ached with both joy and sadness. Then she walked toward me slowly and lifted her arms. I dropped the kindling. She wrapped herself around me, small and warm and silent, the way she used to when she was little. I didn't ask how she got there. I just held her. Inside, I made her a cup of tea and warmed her hands around it while she sat on the sofa, shoulders drawn in. Her gaze wandered around the cabin, like she was stitching pieces of memory together. I pointed to the fireplace. Your grandpa hung that mantle with his own hands, I said softly. She looked at it for a long moment, then turned back to me. I saw your picture, she whispered, in a box in the closet. Mommy said she was going to throw it away, but I took it first. Her voice cracked. Daddy never talks about you anymore. I didn't know where you went. I didn't rush her. I let her words come in their own time, slow and fragile, as if they had been waiting too long to be spoken. Sometimes, she said, I look out the window and think I see you on the sidewalk. I think maybe if I wave, you'll wave back. I reached over and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. You don't need to wave, I told her gently. I'm still here. We spent the rest of the afternoon making sugar cookies, the same recipe I used every December. She remembered the shapes, even remembered which cutter made the crooked little star. Later, we walked down to the creek. The water was low, but it still sang softly over the stones. Amelia skipped a pebble, then another, her small laughter mixing with the sound of moving water. We sat together on the old wooden bench near the bend, the one Gregory had helped me build when he was barely 12. It's quieter here, she said, her voice low. I like that. Nobody talks over me here. I let the silence settle, wrapping around us like a blanket. When the sun began to dip, we walked back to the cabin. Carol had returned and quietly started dinner. Amelia helped set the table. We ate together, just the three of us. No pressure, no explanations, no demands. Afterward, I called a driver I trusted to take her home. Before she left, I wrapped the scarf I had knitted for her years ago around her neck. She hugged me tight at the gate. I'm going to come back, she whispered. I want to learn how to make the crooked stars by myself next time. I watched her climb into the car. The taillights disappeared slowly down the gravel road, blinking faintly between the trees. Inside the cabin, the warmth lingered. For the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like I was holding on to fading memories. It felt like I was making new ones. The next morning, frost still clung to the windowsill. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stepped onto the porch, watching the mist lift slowly off the trees. The silence felt different now. Not heavy, not hollow. It was full, expectant, like something was shifting. When I opened my laptop, I noticed a new email from Elise. The subject line was plain, just my name. I stared at it for a long moment, then clicked. This is affecting Gregory's reputation, it began. Clients are asking questions. He's stressed beyond belief. I know you're hurt, but this isn't the way. I'm asking you, woman to woman, please stop before it damages everything. No greeting, no apology, just pleading, wrapped in the thinnest layer of civility. I sat there for a long time, letting the words settle like dust. I thought about Gregory's silence, how he always disappeared when responsibility pressed too close. Elise had always been the shield, the voice, the one who smiled tightly at family dinners and changed the subject whenever things got uncomfortable. But now, she was the one reaching out. Not to heal, not to ask where things had gone wrong. Just to stop the noise. I took a breath and clicked reply. My fingers moved slowly across the keys. I didn't start this. I typed. You chose to erase me. Now I'm drawing myself back in. I hit send. Just one line. No threats. No drama. It wasn't about revenge. It never had been. What I wanted was clarity. Space. A boundary drawn clean. Later that afternoon, I stood at the cedar desk in the cabin and pulled out the deed. My name was still there. Not his. Not hers. Mine. I placed the document into a folder labeled Transfer of Stewardship. It was almost time. Carol helped me scan the final papers. Linda had drafted everything exactly as I asked. By next week, it would all be official. I glanced at the photograph Amelia had brought from her house, a younger me holding her when she was barely 2. I propped it on the mantel next to one of Gregory at the same age. Same smile, same eyes, different roads. Outside, the wind shifted through the trees. I closed the folder and smoothed my hand across the desk's wood grain. It was the first piece of furniture my husband ever built. Solid, worn, still standing. So was I. The morning sun stretched over Walnut Creek as I walked down the gravel path toward the front gate. A new sign had been mounted on the wooden post. Hand-carved letters, painted in soft green. The cabin was no longer mine in the way it once had been, but it belonged to something larger now. A cause, a purpose. I hadn't just let go of a deed. I had chosen what it would become. The paperwork had been finalized the day before. Carol was there when the representative from the nonprofit signed the transfer. The organization was dedicated to providing retreat spaces for widows, older women healing from grief, and anyone seeking quiet renewal. I explained to them what the cabin carried. That it wasn't just wood and stone. It was memory and warmth. A shelter not just for the body, but for the heart. They promised to preserve that. To protect what mattered. That afternoon, a small local news crew arrived to cover the story. I stayed out of the way at first. But one of the reporters asked, gently, if I would stand for a photo in front of the hearth. I agreed. The photographer adjusted his lens as I stood with my back straight, one hand resting on the mantel. Above me hung the family photo Amelia had returned, the one Elise had nearly thrown away. The frame was slightly chipped, but it stayed. In that moment, I realized something I hadn't before. I was no longer just a bystander in my own story. I was the narrator, the architect, the keeper of memory and choice. Later, I walked out to the edge of the property. The trees whispered softly, the way they always had. I sat on the old bench, now polished and repaired, and let the wind comb gently through my hair. This place had once been built by a man who loved me. Now it would serve women finding their strength again. I watched a group of volunteers unload cushions and cookware from the back of a van. I smiled. Some stories don't end with a final chapter. They shift. They echo forward into other lives. Mine would echo here. And if you've ever felt pushed aside, forgotten, or quietly erased, I want you to know something. Your name still matters. Your presence carries weight. And sometimes, reclaiming yourself begins with one quiet choice. The cabin was no longer my refuge. It had become my promise. A promise that I was still here. And finally, I felt whole.